Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our latest Econ Talk. Gareth, we've had the latest inflation figures for the start of 2026 come out. Headline inflation remaining steady at 3.1%. Now, that's higher than I think anyone was hoping for. The likes of the Reserve Bank had been picking something a little bit more of a slowdown to come through. Market consensus was at 2.9%. Our pick was at 3.0. So coming in a little hotter. It didn't accelerate further. That was sort of the good news. But also, realistically, looking below the surface, still a fair bit of pressure in various areas. Some of the biggest contributors to that 3.1% annual rate was the 12+% increase in electricity prices over the last year. Some pretty big increases, 8.8% increase in rates, local government rates. They're set, of course, back in September, but that annual rate sort of continues to flow through. And the likes of meat and poultry, which saw further price increases in the first 3 months of the year. Looking through the data, there are some areas where you look at and go, well, actually there was a bit more of a slowdown in some prices. The likes of core inflation didn't shoot up or anything like that. But a lot of this also effectively predates the Iran war and a lot of those pricing pressures that have come through from the likes of fuel. The likes of petrol prices were only up 1.1% on average for the quarter compared to a year ago. The likes of other fuels, including diesel, up 8.3% from a year ago. Now, when you've seen that the actual numbers on a month-to-month basis are more like 40% plus, clearly there's a lot more coming through. If this is only the early stage, how bad might inflation get?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you look at numbers going forward, we're picking inflation possibly being as high as 4.8% per annum in the June quarter. That would be a quarterly increase of more than 2% in prices in that quarter alone. And the Reserve Bank's own forecast was up at 4.2 as well that they recently published. So there's a fair amount of consensus on the sort of extent of the lift. There's a bit of variation around that, but certainly a substantial increase to come through. I mean, basically, to put it simply, you've seen less than a third of the effect of the fuel price increases in the data that we had earlier this week around inflation, and there'll be a lot more to come through. We know that oil prices are still hovering somewhere close to $100 a barrel, and yes, there's little bits and pieces of good news which don't last very long in terms of ceasefires or the Strait being open and then not being open, that sort of thing. We have seen a little bit of relief in terms of refined fuel prices coming out of Singapore, which has helped to bring those diesel prices back a little bit from their peak. But the reality is they're still massively elevated, right, from where they were the previous quarter before the conflict began. So there will be a lot more of that coming through in the next quarter. I'd also expect to see some of the flow-on effects of that just start to appear, but it's only the very early stages in terms of higher transport costs. So for things that directly use fuel, whether it's around airfares, I'm not so sure about that one in terms of the way that Stats NZ does their pricing, but say taxi prices or other sort of transport prices as well, you might just see a little bit of that coming through. But the reality is that a lot of those sort of first round effects and then second round effects of these higher fuel prices, they will take time to flow through the system, and the longer that fuel prices remain elevated, of course, the greater the risk that those second round effects become significant. So yeah, this is sort of a bit of historical data we've got really, and news, and it wasn't bad, like you say, those sort of core measures not picking up, but there's a hell of a lot worse to come in terms of quarterly numbers coming through over the next few months.
And look, I guess for the Reserve Bank, right, they watch this data closely. Their job is to keep inflation contained. Is that this is effectively, like you say, for most of this data, effectively predates the large effects, which means that the starting point is that little bit worse for them in a sense. They're expecting 3.0% for the annual figure. It came in at 3.1. That 0.1 is not huge. But when you look below the surface, you do just start to worry when you look at some of those pricing figures and you go, why are businesses raising their prices? Why are they feeling so readily available to raise their prices despite a weak economy, despite a much higher unemployment rate, which would normally constrain that ability? I mean, you had some stuff like the likes of household textiles prices, which increased quite significantly, some cultural service prices that increased, the repair of home appliances, which went up nearly 10% over the last year. I mean, none of those are particularly large parts of the inflation basket, don't get me wrong. But you do sit there and go, man, are people really struggling that much in the economy when they think they can raise prices 10% for some of those sort of items? It does suggest, again, that pricing discipline really sort of has fallen back. We also had NZIER's quarterly survey of business opinion. The actual sort of business confidence figures, funnily enough, plunged. Well, we would have expected that. But you were also still at the same time seeing more and more businesses going, you know what, I think that my prices that I'm going to have to increase or charge in the future are going to go up. The costs that I've been wearing myself have been increasing. And again, we've only sort of seen some of those early hits. What does that mean for the outlook? Normally, the Reserve Bank would look through an oil price shock because it hopefully sort of comes out. It's temporary at some point. But how much risk are we seeing already of that potential sort of pass-through of price increases? And how does the Reserve Bank respond?
Yeah, I mean, we've got probably a more hawkish view around some of that pass-through, and like you say, some of those cost pressures leading into this fuel price spike and around inflation expectations and sort of pricing behaviour does look to be a little bit concerning. And it's not going to get any better when you've got these real cost pressures coming through and impacting on businesses. If they were willing to pass on other costs previously, they'll be just as willing to pass on these more, I guess, almost concrete costs that are coming through as well. So difficult for the Reserve Bank. Look, today, or the data we've seen in terms of the CPI, there's not enough there for them to move in May, and that would have been remarkable. It would have had to been a much higher result for that to occur. But we think that the evidence will build over the next 2 or 3 months. A lot of it will still be anecdotal, probably, and so it does depend a little bit on how the Reserve Bank reads that and whether they sort of can read between the lines in terms of what is going on and business behaviour. But we are still looking for interest rates to rise from July and 3 increases by the end of this year. Worth also remembering that the exchange rate is still relatively low and relatively stimulatory, sitting below US 60 cents. And that may be a bit of a factor in terms of some of that inflation that's coming through as well, is that there is an import component to it there, everything getting more expensive as the New Zealand dollar remains relatively weak. So a whole bunch of things there that Reserve Bank does need to take into account, but at the moment the picture doesn't look great in terms of them needing to act sooner rather than later.
And I think, look, market pricing still pretty consistent with 3 increases this year, starting from roughly July, which is sort of in keeping with our thinking. And I think it was also quite instructive yesterday looking at the likes of non-tradable inflation. So things that are much more domestically focused, can't be influenced, aren't as influenced by international pressures as much, still sitting at 3.5% on the annual rate. That's the 3rd quarter in a row that you've had that figure. So at a time when, the non-tradables isn't going to be affected by that jump up in fuel prices immediately. So there's none of that effect coming through. And you've also got the fact that you would be expecting the domestic pricing pressures to start to pull back a bit over time. And they haven't been. They've been holding at that 3.5%. Really does highlight the sort of conundrum that the Reserve Bank has got. The economy will be weaker because of this oil price shock. People will be spending less, either because they're spending more on fuel and less on other things, or because confidence is, funnily enough, shot again. But for the Reserve Bank, they're also looking at those pricing pressures and going, remember last time that we sort of said, here's all the reasons that the theory would work and inflation shouldn't get out of control, and then it did. They clearly don't want a repeat of that this time. So a lot of water still to go under the bridge, a lot of pricing pressure conversations still to work through, and we'll assess all of that on a future Econ Talk.